Dr. David Satcher at Morehouse Medical School, who was the head of the Center for Disease Controls and the former Surgeon General of the U.S., and Dr. Harold Varmus of Sloan Kettering, who's the former head of NIH, formed the Alzheimer's Study Group. So we have tried to assemble a team that really brings a unique level of expertise, and I'm going to try to broadly represent their thinking and add a few points in my summary. I also want to thank the Alzheimer's Association leadership. Their 2008 Alzheimer's Disease Facts and Figures is as useful an introduction to this and as authoritative as there is in the country, and they do an extraordinary job of pulling together people who have a deep concern about Alzheimer's. I want to thank George Vradenberg, who's been particularly helpful in coaching Rob Egge, who is the staff director of the Alzheimer's Study Group, and myself in working on this. You've already mentioned the impact of Alzheimer's again and again, and I recommend to all of you, if you have a chance to see Merle Comer's video, which is very powerful. My sister-in-law's mother currently has Alzheimer's. I think a number of you, as well as Justice O'Connor, have outlined the personal human challenge and the pain for the family. Many years ago, I called Nancy Reagan one evening, and she said, it is such a cruel disease because you're dealing with a person who in every way looks like the person you used to know, and yet in so many ways they've changed. And I think that captured the sense of cruelty and difficulty. And yet there's enormous hope for a better future. And the Alzheimer's Study Group has established 5 areas that's in the testimony: encouraging collaboration among researchers, improving Alzheimer's clinical trials, rapid learning from large electronic health data sets, integrating a community-based care model, and providing better information to policymakers. And I think if we look at the possibilities, I want to start with a broad generalization. And I would really encourage the entire Congress and the executive branch to take this much more seriously than we do. We're going to have 4 to 7 times as much new science in the next quarter century as we had in the last quarter century. 65% of it will come from outside the United States. No one on the planet understands how you cope with this flood of new information. Research on the brain will be one of the most extraordinary areas of explosive new knowledge because it is the most complex area of science. And we've only had really decent technologies for the last 15 years. Almost all of them, by the way, came out of the National Science Foundation investment, not the National Institute of Health. It is physics and math, which is the underlying base of the tools which allow researchers into the brain to acquire real-time data about living brains. And so it's very important to understand that a truly basic research strategy has to involve the National Science Foundation as well as the National Institute of Health. If you take seriously what I just said, and I'd be glad to answer a question about how we got to the 4 to 7 number, it is inconceivable that we know today as policymakers what's possible. If we get 4 times as much new science, then trying to think out to 2033, which is not very far away if you're thinking about something like Alzheimer's. I mean, look around this room and look at the number of people who are likely to be alive in 2033, and look at the number who are likely to be entering precisely the age that Justice O'Connor talked about. And all of a sudden, this gets to be very personal for most of the people in this room. 2033, and we get 4 times as much new science. You are the equivalent of a Senate committee in 1880 trying to understand today. 1880 is pre-automobile, pre-airplane, pre-radio, pre-motion picture, pre-long-distance telephone, pre-electric light. I mean, how would you explain to a Senate committee of 1880 how you got to work this week, or how you go back home to your state, or how you stay in touch, or the BlackBerry in your pocket, or the cell phone with a camera? And yet no one tries to say, you know, if we could have breakthroughs on that scale, what's our investment strategy? And if I had one really powerful thing I'd like to get you to focus on, it is to take head on the Office of Management and Budget, Congressional Budget Office design. I was startled about 4 years ago. I was trying to understand what we're doing wrong in the global war on terror and on Iraq. And I met with Fred Smith of FedEx to talk about our lack of metrics and our lack of ability to manage large systems. And at one point in our breakfast, he said, government cannot distinguish between investment and cost. And therefore, government could never tolerate in building FedEx or UPS, because you could never explain why the wireless and the laptop are so central. Now, I will say to you as an aside that as an illustration, if I might, the recent decisions by the Census Bureau are so out of touch with modern reality they verge on insanity. And yet nobody's standing up and saying, let me get this straight, in the age of eBay, YouTube, Facebook, MySpace, Google, we're going to hire 600,000 temporary workers to do a paper and pencil census in 2010, which would be grounds, I would argue, for replacing the entire department. And just saying anybody dumb enough to believe in this is so out of touch. But let me suggest to you, when you look at Alzheimer's, we have current projections of $1.2 trillion in federal spending for the baby boom generation, matched by $1.2 trillion in personal spending. Now, if you instructed the Congressional Budget Office to design a generational investment strategy, because you know what's going to happen. We're going to run out of money. And we're going to nickel and dime truly stupid things to try to save money in Medicare and Medicaid, when if you started right now and had an investment strategy, you might postpone Alzheimer's by 5 years. If you postpone Alzheimer's by 5 years, you save half that money, $600 billion. Now, if you were to say, what's the time value of money, and could we set up an amendment to the Budget Act for an investment strategy that is fundamentally off budget but manageable and defined, and that counts against future savings? And this applies to many diseases, but in particular, since we're here today talking about Alzheimer's, it applies massively to Alzheimer's. Now, let me carry a stage further. You have to look at, first of all, how do you accelerate basic research in the world I'm describing? I think that means that, and I say this having helped double the NIH budget while we were